Section 1. Homer Simpson, the broken engine. Close your eyes for a moment and picture Homer Simpson. You already can. You didn't even have to think about it. That round, yellow face, the heavy-lidded eyes that always look slightly confused, like a man who just woke up and isn't entirely sure what year it is. The 5 o'clock shadow that somehow never turns into a full beard. The gut that stretches every shirt he's ever owned. The 3 remaining hairs on top of his head that flutter in a breeze like a flag planted on a hill nobody wanted to conquer. You know this man. You have always known this man. He has been on television longer than most people watching this video have been alive. He is, by any reasonable measure, the most recognized fictional character in American history. Not Superman, not Mickey Mouse. Homer Simpson. The safety inspector who cannot safely inspect anything. The father who means well and destroys everything. The husband who is somehow, impossibly, still married, despite being almost cosmically ill-suited for the responsibilities of adult life. And the question we are going to sit with tonight, the question that tends to arrive quietly right around the moment you're drifting off and your mind starts wandering down darker corridors, is this. What if Homer Simpson was never supposed to be like this? Not in the sense that the writers made a mistake, not in the sense that the character was mishandled or the show lost its way. In the sense that within the actual story, within the fictional universe of Springfield itself, Homer Simpson was systematically, deliberately, and methodically prevented from becoming anything other than what he is. Because when you lay out the full timeline of Homer's life, when you follow every thread the show has ever offered about who this man is and how he got here, you don't find a bumbling everyman who stumbled into a nuclear power plant job. You find a crime scene. You find a man who was robbed before he even understood what he had. Let's start at the very beginning, which is also the darkest place. Homer was born in Springfield. He grew up in a house with a father named Abraham Simpson, a man the show has established as emotionally distant, prone to tall tales, incapable of warmth, and deeply, almost pathologically conflict-averse. Abe was not a cruel father in the obvious sense. He didn't beat Homer. He didn't scream at him. He did something quieter and in many ways worse. He withheld. He looked at his son and decided that full honesty, full presence, full engagement was simply too much to ask of himself. Homer's mother, Mona, disappeared when Homer was very young. A child of 6 years old, a little boy who woke up one morning, and the most important person in his world was simply gone. No explanation. No goodbye that he could understand or hold on to. His father told him she was dead, showed him a grave. Let him grieve a woman who was actually alive, who was out there somewhere, breathing and moving through the world, being a person, while her son grew up believing he was the kind of child a mother would rather leave behind than raise. Think about what that does to a 6-year-old brain. Developmental psychology is quite clear on this. The early loss of a primary attachment figure, especially when that loss is unexplained or surrounded by deception, doesn't just cause grief. It restructures the personality. It rewires the fundamental way a child understands relationships. It teaches a very specific lesson, one that gets absorbed so deeply it becomes invisible, becomes part of the architecture of who you are. And the lesson is this: people leave. Love is temporary. Anything you care about can vanish without warning and without reason. And the best strategy for surviving in a world like that is to make yourself as likable, as needed, as impossible to abandon as you possibly can. Look at Homer as an adult, and you see every single symptom. His desperate, almost frantic need to be liked. His inability to let go of relationships even when they're clearly bad for him. His willingness to endure humiliation, to absorb mockery, to accept being forgotten and dismissed and overlooked by his own employer rather than walk away. Because walking away means being alone. And being alone is what happened when he was 6 years old and his mother disappeared. And the 6-year-old who experienced that never entirely grew up. He's still in there. He's still sitting in that empty house waiting for the person who left to come back. That's the emotional architecture. Now let's talk about the cognitive one. The show establishes across multiple episodes that Homer has an IQ of approximately 55. 55. That is a number that, in clinical terms, places a person in a range associated with significant cognitive disability. Not low average, not below average, a level of intellectual function that in the real world would make independent adult life genuinely difficult. And the show plays this as comedy. Homer is funny because he doesn't understand things. Homer is funny because he makes catastrophically bad decisions. Homer is funny because his brain simply does not work the way brains are supposed to work. But then the show does something extraordinary. It explains why. Season 12, an episode called HOMR. Homer discovers, through a series of medical misadventures, that a crayon has been lodged in his brain since childhood. A standard everyday crayon pushed up through his nasal passage and embedded in his frontal lobe. And when the crayon is removed, Homer's intelligence skyrockets. He becomes articulate, he becomes perceptive. He starts reading books and understanding them. He has a conversation with Lisa that is genuinely, intellectually equal. He sees Springfield clearly, perhaps for the first time, and what he sees is a place of extraordinary bleakness. A place where intelligence is lonely, where insight is punished, where being the smartest person in the room just means you understand the dimensions of your own cage more precisely than everyone else. And Homer, faced with a choice between clarity and comfort, chooses comfort. He has the crayon put back in. He chooses to return to the fog. Now, the show presents this as a tragic but ultimately personal decision. Homer made his choice. Homer went back to being Homer. The end. But there is a question underneath that question that the show never asks. How did the crayon get there in the first place? How does a child shove a crayon far enough into his nasal cavity to penetrate the brain and not receive immediate medical attention? How does he go through his entire childhood, his entire adolescence, his entire adult life? Visiting doctors in Springfield, receiving whatever passed for medical care in a town powered by a leaking nuclear reactor, and not a single medical professional finds a foreign object lodged in his skull? There are two possibilities. The first is that every doctor in Springfield is so comprehensively incompetent that they missed a crayon in a patient's brain for the better part of 3 decades. The second is that someone knew the crayon was there and chose not to remove it. And if you know who runs Springfield, if you know who owns the hospital and the power plant and the newspaper and the political apparatus of the town, if you know who has a documented interest in maintaining a workforce that is compliant and uncritical and incapable of asking inconvenient questions, then the second possibility starts to feel less like a conspiracy theory and more like a reasonable inference. Burns needed Homer to be the way he is. Burns needed a safety inspector who would not inspect, who would sit at the control panel and eat donuts and fall asleep, and never, ever ask why there are skeletons in the basement. And Homer, with a crayon in his brain and radiation in his water, and a childhood shaped by abandonment and deception, was exactly the right kind of broken. Then there's the body. Homer Simpson has been shot. He has been electrocuted. He has fallen off cliffs, been hit by cars, been launched out of cannons, been caught in explosions, been buried under rubble, been mauled by various animals, and been subjected to physical trauma that would be immediately and absolutely fatal to any actual human being. He survives all of it. He doesn't just survive it, he recovers from it within the span of a single episode, sometimes within the span of a single scene. The radiation theory, which we'll explore in greater depth when we get to Burns, suggests that Homer's near indestructibility is a mutation. That decades of living in Springfield's contaminated environment, of drinking water that flows through pipes downstream of a nuclear facility with 342 safety violations, of breathing air that carries microscopic particles of whatever is leaking out of those cracked cooling towers, has altered Homer's biology at a fundamental level, made him durable in ways that human beings are not supposed to be durable, resilient in ways that shouldn't be possible. The coma theory takes a different approach. It suggests that Homer's indestructibility isn't physical at all. That Homer has been unconscious since April 1993, lying in a hospital bed following a vending machine accident, and that everything that has happened since then is a dream generated by a damaged brain that refuses to let its creator die. In which case, Homer survives everything because nothing is actually happening to his body. His body is lying still in a hospital bed. Only his mind is in Springfield. And a dream can't kill the person who's dreaming it. Both theories arrive at the same portrait. A man who cannot be destroyed despite being almost entirely powerless. A man who endures everything without accumulating anything. A man who falls and gets up and falls again in an endless loop that never moves him forward, never moves him backward, just keeps him turning in place on the same piece of ground, in the same town, in the same miserable loop, while the decades pass, and his children never age and his boss never remembers his name. There is one more piece of Homer's dark theory that deserves to be spoken slowly, because it's the kind of thing that tends to settle in right at the edge of sleep, when the brain is loose and willing to follow ideas into places it would normally turn back from. Homer chose the crayon. When given the genuine, actual option of being intelligent, of being fully himself, of inhabiting the potential that whatever combination of genetics and early experience actually built into him before the radiation and the crayon and the abandonment had their way, Homer looked at that version of himself and said no. He looked at clarity and chose fog. He looked at understanding and chose confusion. Not because he was stupid. In that moment, with the crayon out, he was not stupid. He made a clear-eyed, rational decision that being smart in Springfield was too painful to sustain. And that might be the darkest thing about Homer Simpson, not the things that were done to him. The things that were done to him are terrible. But they were done. They happened in the past. They were inflicted by other people with other agendas. The darkest thing is that at the one moment when Homer had the chance to undo some of it, to take back some of what was stolen from him, he chose not to. Because the world he had been built to navigate required him to be the way he is. His coping mechanisms were designed for a man of limited cognition. His marriage, his friendships, his job, his entire life in Springfield was structured around a particular version of Homer. The smart version didn't fit. The smart version was a stranger in the house on Evergreen Terrace. So the crayon went back in, the fog rolled back, and Homer Simpson went back to being the man that Springfield made him, which is also the man that Springfield needed him to be. The broken engine, still running, still powering the machine, still showing up to work every morning in Sector 7G, still pressing the same buttons, still falling asleep at the console, still dreaming, maybe, of a version of his life where a crayon is just a crayon and a mother doesn't vanish and a boss remembers your name. That is Homer Simpson. That is who he actually is underneath the jokes, underneath the strangling, underneath the donuts and the beer and the impossibly durable yellow body that refuses to stay hurt. He is a man who was robbed at 6 years old and has spent every day since then trying to fill the space with enough noise and warmth and love that he doesn't notice what's missing. It doesn't always work, but he keeps trying. And maybe that's the saddest and the most beautiful thing about him. He keeps trying. If you're still with me, drop your time and location in the comments below. There's something calming about knowing someone else is drifting through Springfield at the same hour you are. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is a good time. We have a long night ahead of us, and there is so much more to find in the dark corners of this town. Section 2. Marge Simpson, the saint who swallowed her screams. Marge Simpson has the most recognizable silhouette in American television. That tower of blue hair rising improbably straight from her head like a monument to patience, like a physical structure built from all the things she has decided not to say. The pearls, the green dress, the low, slightly nasal voice that carries warmth, like an old radiator in a cold house, steady and constant and taken entirely for granted by everyone it keeps warm. She is the good one. She is the sane one. She is the anchor, the compass, the emotional center of the Simpson family and by extension of Springfield itself. When everything falls apart, which it does approximately once per episode, Marge is the one who puts it back together. When Homer makes a catastrophic decision, which he does with the regularity of a weather pattern, Marge absorbs the consequences and finds a way forward. She worries out loud in a low murmur. She hums to herself when she's anxious. She makes casseroles. She is, on the surface, the most uncomplicated character on the show. The steadfast wife. The devoted mother. The woman who chose to love a man who required extraordinary amounts of maintenance and has never once seriously questioned that choice. But here's the question that tends to arrive quietly, somewhere between the surface and what's underneath it. What did Marge Simpson want to be? Not what did she become. Not what role she occupies in the structure of the Simpson family. What did she, as a person with her own interior life and her own ambitions and her own capacity for wanting things that had nothing to do with the people around her, what did she want? Because the show, across 36 years and hundreds of episodes, gives us fragmentary, flickering answers to that question. And every fragment is a little heartbreaking. Marge was a painter. This is not a minor detail. The show establishes in multiple episodes that Marge has genuine artistic talent, that she has an eye for color and composition and beauty that goes far beyond amateur dabbling. She paints a portrait of Mr. Burns that is technically accomplished enough to be displayed prominently. She creates work that people respond to with genuine admiration. She has a gift. And what happens to the gift? It gets shelved. It gets returned to, briefly, when the plot requires it, and then it gets shelved again. Because painting is not something that fits into the rhythm of life on Evergreen Terrace. Because there is always another disaster requiring management, another child requiring emotional scaffolding, another husband requiring supervision. The painting doesn't go away. The talent doesn't disappear. It gets pushed to the margins, carried quietly alongside everything else Marge carries, never quite extinguished, but never quite allowed to burn either. She wanted to be a police officer. There is a whole episode, Marge on the Lam, built around the electric surge of energy that moves through Marge when she discovers what it feels like to be competent in a context that has nothing to do with her family. She's good at it. She's genuinely, naturally suited to police work in a way that Chief Wiggum, for all his institutional authority, is fundamentally not. And then the episode ends and Marge goes home. Because the episode always ends. Because Marge always goes home. She wanted to be a real estate agent and was successful at it. She wanted to be a pretzel vendor. She wanted to write a novel. She wanted things, many things, across many years, and the pattern of every single one of them is the same. She finds it. She's good at it. She feels briefly like a person whose existence extends beyond the management of other people's needs. And then the thing ends, or gets taken away, or gets quietly abandoned, when the weight of her actual life requires her full attention again. There is a specific kind of exhaustion that belongs to people who are very good at taking care of others and very bad at requiring care themselves. It's a particular flavor of invisible. The people around you are always fine, always managed, always held together, and the question of whether you yourself are fine never quite gets asked because you are the person who asks those questions, and asking them about yourself feels like a category error. Marge has had that exhaustion for 36 years, and here is where the dark theory begins to take shape. Because Marge's steadiness, her patience, her seemingly limitless capacity for absorption and recovery is not what it appears to be. It is not serenity, it is not contentment, it is compression. Marge Simpson has been compressing her own internal life for the entirety of the show's run. And the show gives us, in scattered episodes, brief windows into what that compression has cost her. She has anxiety. Clinical, genuine anxiety. The kind that manifests physically, that sends her to therapy, that has on multiple occasions rendered her functionally unable to do things she would otherwise be able to do. The show addresses this in the episode Fear of Flying, where Marge's anxiety about flying is revealed to be a displacement for much deeper, older fears rooted in her childhood relationship with her father, who was an airline steward. The episode ends with Marge beginning therapy. And then the next episode begins and Marge is fine again, because the show always resets, because Springfield always forgets. But the anxiety doesn't actually go away just because the episode ended. The show has shown us that it's there, that it's been there for a long time, that it's woven into the foundation of how Marge moves through the world. She manages it the way she manages everything. Quietly. Without making it anyone else's problem. Without requiring the kind of sustained attention that she provides for everyone around her. She once nearly had an affair. This episode is called The Last Temptation of Homer, and it's told from Homer's perspective. about his near infidelity with a colleague, and Marge's near infidelity is almost a footnote. But think about what it means. Marge, who has absorbed years of Homer's failures and absences and spectacular incompetence, is susceptible to the attention of a man who simply notices her, who asks about her painting, who listens when she talks about herself. The bar is so low it's underground, and Marge still nearly trips over it, because that is how little of that kind of basic human recognition she receives in the life she has built. She married Homer when she was pregnant with Bart. The show has revisited this moment multiple times, and each revisit adds texture to what it actually meant. Marge and Homer were young. They were not quite ready. There was a pregnancy that accelerated a timeline that might, in a different world, have moved more slowly. And Marge chose to get married, chose to build this life with full knowledge of who Homer was and what she was taking on. That choice was not made under duress. Marge is not a passive person. She is not someone things happen to. She is someone who decides. But there is a difference between a choice being freely made and a choice being made under conditions that severely constrain the available options. Marge was young. She was pregnant. She was in Springfield, which, as we will come to understand, is not a place that makes it easy to want things that lie outside the established order. The show has established that the town itself has a kind of gravitational pull toward the status quo, a collective force that keeps people in their designated places. And Marge's designated place was, from the moment Bart was born, the center of the Simpson family. She has been at that center ever since. And the family has needed her there. Really, genuinely needed her. Without Marge, the Simpson household would collapse inside of a week. Homer would forget to feed the children. Bart would burn something down. Lisa would spiral into a depression that no 8-year-old should have to navigate alone. Maggie would be fine, actually, but that's a story for later. The point is that Marge is not irreplaceable in the way that people sometimes say about caregivers as a compliment. She is irreplaceable in the way that a load-bearing wall is irreplaceable. The house does not stand without her, and she knows this. She has always known this. And the knowing is both the source of her power and the weight that keeps her in place. There is a theory, one of the quieter ones, that suggests Marge Simpson has simply never allowed herself to want too much, because wanting too much is what leads to the kind of disappointment she watched her own mother carry for a lifetime. The show gives us glimpses of Patty and Selma, Marge's sisters, as cautionary tales in both directions. Patty and Selma are bitter. They are disappointed. They made their peace with smallness in a way that hardened into something that looks, from the outside, like contempt. Marge looked at them and went a different direction. Not more ambitious exactly, but warmer. More committed to finding satisfaction in the life she has rather than grieving the life she doesn't. And that is noble. There is something genuinely admirable about the choice to love what you have rather than spend your life mourning what you wanted. But there is also a version of that choice that is less about wisdom and more about survival. Less about genuine acceptance and more about the quiet recognition that some doors, once they close, don't reopen, and that the kindest thing you can do for yourself is to stop standing outside them. Marge has blue hair because it is naturally gray. This is actually established in the show. Marge dyes her hair. She has been dyeing her hair since before we met her, and she will presumably keep dyeing it forever, because the alternative, letting it show what it actually looks like, would be a kind of admission that she is not quite willing to make. Not an admission of age, exactly, but something adjacent to it. An admission that she is not entirely the person she presents to the world. That behind the tower of improbable blue there is a gray that she keeps covered, that she tends to every week with quiet, domestic precision, as part of the ongoing project of being Marge Simpson. The pearls are always on. The dress is always the same. The hair is always blue. The humming is always there, that low, worried sound that fills the kitchen in the morning, like the hum of the refrigerator. Just part of the ambient noise of the house. Something you stop noticing after a while. Something that would be startlingly loud in its absence. Connect this to the radiation theory and the picture darkens slightly. If Springfield's contaminated environment affects the biology of its residents, if the water and the air carry the invisible fingerprint of the leaking power plant, then Marge's gray hair, premature graying at an early age, is one more symptom. One more quiet physical marker of what living in this town costs the body. The show never makes this explicit. It's just there in the background. A detail you either notice or don't, like most of the things about Marge. Connect it to the coma theory and it becomes something else entirely. If Homer is dreaming, if every episode since 1993 is generated by a man lying unconscious in Springfield General, then Marge as Homer sees her is Marge as Homer needs her to be. Patient, constant, never aging, never changing, never leaving. Homer's deepest fear, the fear that was built into him when his mother disappeared, is the fear of being left. And in the coma, Marge never leaves. She is locked in place beside him, patient as she has always been, the blue hair always blue, the pearls always on, the hum always there in the kitchen where it belongs. If Homer is dreaming, then Marge is the dream of a man who has been afraid of waking up to an empty house since he was 6 years old. And the dream keeps her exactly as she was on the last morning before everything went wrong. That is the dark theory of Marge Simpson. Not that she is unhappy, exactly. Not that her life is a tragedy in any straightforward sense. She loves her children. She loves Homer in the particular, complicated way that you can love someone who requires so much of you that the question of who you are without them becomes genuinely unanswerable. The dark theory is simpler and quieter than tragedy. It is that Marge Simpson is a person who has been so good at being needed for so long that the question of what she needs has become almost impossible to ask. It's not that no one asks it, it's that she herself has forgotten how to hear it. The humming fills the space where the answer would be. The casserole goes in the oven. The hair stays blue. And somewhere underneath all of it, in the quiet part of herself that she keeps very still, there are paintings that never got painted and books that never got written, and a version of Marge who woke up one morning and decided that her needs were not, after all, a burden that the people she loved should be required to carry. That version of Marge is still in there, behind the pearls, underneath the hair, in the pauses between the hums. She's still in there, and she's still waiting for someone to ask. There is one more piece of Marge's dark theory that sits at the bottom of everything else. One detail that, once noticed, reframes every scene she is in. Marge has never left. This sounds obvious until you think about it in the context of what the show has given her. She has been given options. Not many, and not well-resourced, but genuine options. She has discovered things she is good at, things outside the domestic sphere, things that could, with different circumstances, have built into a life that had more of her in it. And every time, without exception, she comes back. The theory is not that Marge is trapped. The theory is that Marge has looked at the option of leaving, whatever leaving might mean in any particular situation, and decided consciously, repeatedly, that the people in the house need her more than she needs whatever the option offers. That her own needs are less urgent than theirs. That the math always works out the same way, and the answer is always that she stays. This is presented by the show, consistently, as love. As a choice made from love. And it is. It contains real love in the way that many chosen sacrifices contain the real thing. But it is also a pattern, and patterns have causes, and the cause of Marge's pattern has roots that go back to before she met Homer, to a family that taught her, through example and expectation, that women in Marge's position manage. They absorb, they stay. Her mother managed. Her sisters reacted against managing by becoming bitter. Marge found the middle path, the one that preserved her warmth while sacrificing her space, and she has been walking it since before Bart was born. The question the show asks, very quietly in the episodes where Marge gets closest to the edge, is whether there is a version of this path that is sustainable. Whether a person can give indefinitely without eventually reaching a point where the giving costs more than it returns. Whether the hum is enough, whether the painting on the wall, half finished, put away when the cast casserole needed attention, is sustainable as evidence of an interior life rather than an expression of it. The show does not answer this question. The show was never going to answer this question because answering it would require letting Marge change, and Springfield does not permit change. The hair stays blue, the hum continues. And somewhere in the kitchen, in the pause before the next thing needs doing, Marge is a person who once wanted things that had nothing to do with anyone else, and who carries that wanting quietly, like a stone in a pocket, so familiar by now that she barely notices the weight. Section 3. Bart Simpson, the rebel with no cause because the cause was stolen. Bart Simpson is 10 years old, and he has been 10 years old for 36 years. He is the most famous 10-year-old in the world. The underachiever, the troublemaker. The kid who writes punishment sentences on the chalkboard at the opening of every episode. I will not waste chalk. I will not torment the emotionally frail. I will not conduct my own firing range. The sentences change, but the punishment stays the same. And Bart stays 10, and the joke never quite gets old because Bart himself never quite gets old. Because nothing in Springfield does. He's the one everyone wanted to be when they were kids. The skateboard, the slingshot, the total immunity to authority that reads, from the outside, like freedom. Bart says what he thinks. Bart does what he wants. Bart has no particular regard for the social contract, for the feelings of adults, for the kind of careful, face-saving performance that most people start learning before they start school. He is, on the surface, spectacularly liberated from the anxieties that make most children miserable. And that is exactly the performance he has been giving for 36 years. Because here is what we know about Bart Simpson when you push past the skateboard and the catchphrases and the spectacular talent for disruption. Bart Simpson is a child who has been told implicitly and explicitly and consistently since before he could form a sentence that he is not good enough, not smart enough, not the right kind of child. He is the wrong Simpson. He is the one who came before the plan was ready, born to young parents who weren't quite prepared, shaped from his earliest days by the shadow of his own reputation as the difficult one. He failed the 3rd grade, not because he couldn't learn. The show gives us repeated evidence that Bart has a sharp, quick, genuinely creative intelligence, the kind that doesn't sit still, that doesn't fit neatly into the architecture of standardized education, that looks like failure from the outside because the system it's being measured against was designed for a different kind of mind. He fails the 3rd grade because the 3rd grade, as Springfield delivers it, is not built for Bart. But Bart doesn't know that. Bart hears the message the situation is sending him, which is the same message he has been receiving from teachers and principals and authority figures since the beginning. You are not built right. You don't fit. You are the kind of child who needs to be corrected, managed, contained. And Bart, being Bart, responds to containment the way all compressed things eventually respond. By exploding. The rebellion is real. There is genuine, electric, irrepressible energy in Bart Simpson's defiance. He is not performing misbehavior because he thinks it's cool, though he certainly thinks it's cool. He misbehaves because misbehavior is the only mode of expression that has never been taken from him. They can take his grades, they can take his dignity, they can put him in detention and make him write sentences and call his parents, and deploy the full weight of Springfield Elementary's institutional disappointment in his direction. But they cannot take his chaos. His chaos is entirely his own. The tragedy of Bart Simpson is visible in the episodes where the mask slips. And it slips more than people notice, more than the show gets credit for depicting. There is a recurring dynamic between Bart and his father that the show returns to compulsively across its entire run. It is a dynamic of almost unbearable mutual need and chronic mutual disappointment. Homer and Bart love each other with a ferocity that neither of them is particularly equipped to express. Homer wants to be a good father and lacks almost every skill necessary to be one. Bart wants to be seen by his father and has learned, through repeated experience, that being seen by Homer is an intermittent and unreliable proposition. The strangling is a joke. It has always been a joke. Homer grabs Bart by the throat, and the music plays and the audience laughs, and then everything resets. But underneath the joke is the specific, painful shape of a father who does not know how to say "I'm disappointed" without his hands, and a son who has learned to expect the physical expression of his father's frustration as a reliable indicator that he has, again, failed to be what his father needed him to be. Bart's relationship with authority figures outside the family is almost a clinical catalog of displacement. Principal Skinner functions as a kind of anti-father figure, a man who represents everything Homer lacks in terms of discipline and structure and institutional authority. And Bart's torment of Skinner is relentless and creative and deeply personal in a way that goes far beyond ordinary childhood mischief. Bart needs Skinner to be the villain, needs him to be the representative of the system that has decided Bart doesn't fit. Because if the system has a face, then Bart's rebellion has a target, and a target makes the rebellion feel like resistance rather than just noise. Sideshow Bob is even more interesting. The relationship between Bart and Bob, the criminal mastermind who has tried to kill Bart on multiple occasions and who Bart has repeatedly managed to expose and foil, is one of the most sustained dynamics in the show's history. And if you look at it through a dark lens, it reads as Bart's unconscious quest for a worthy adversary, someone who takes him seriously, someone who sees him as a genuine threat, as someone to be reckoned with, as someone whose intelligence is real and dangerous rather than inconvenient and tiresome. Even Bob's murderous attention is, in a deeply uncomfortable way, a form of being seen. Bart was a gifted artist. This comes up in the episode Bart Gets Famous, and it comes up elsewhere, quietly, in the background of scenes where Bart is drawing or creating something with his hands. There is a visual intelligence in Bart that mirrors Marge's artistic gift, a family inheritance that gets expressed in Marge as painting and in Bart as the particular visual poetry of a truly excellent prank. The engineering of chaos is an art form. Bart is its practitioner. And like Marge, like every Simpson with a gift, he never quite gets to develop it into something that the world around him is built to receive. Now let's talk about the radiation angle, because Bart is the character where it gets most interesting. The show has established, across many episodes, that Bart has at various points displayed extraordinary abilities that seem inconsistent with his baseline characterization as a cheerful underachiever. He has shown flashes of genuine strategic genius. He has demonstrated emotional intelligence that puts adults around him to shame. He has done things, on multiple occasions, that required a level of planning and execution that a child operating at the level the school system has assessed him to be operating at simply should not be capable of. The radiation theory suggests that Springfield's contaminated environment doesn't depress everyone equally, that the mutation the power plant's runoff has introduced into Springfield's biology is not uniform, that it affects different individuals in different ways. In Homer, it contributed to cognitive impairment. In Maggie, the theory suggests it went in the opposite direction, toward enhancement. Bart occupies the complicated middle space, a mind that is genuinely capable, perhaps extraordinarily capable, that has been shaped by both the mutation and the environment in ways that make it brilliant and frustrated and unable to find the container it needs. He is too smart to be comfortable in the role of dumb troublemaker and not positioned, emotionally or institutionally, to access the role of gifted student. He falls through the gap between those two categories, and the fall has been going on for 36 years. There is one more element of Bart's dark theory that deserves to be spoken before we move on. Bart has a best friend, Milhouse Van Houten, and their friendship, which is one of the most consistent and in many ways most honest relationships in the show, tells you something about what Bart actually values when the performance is stripped away. Milhouse is not cool. Milhouse is, by any objective assessment of the Springfield social hierarchy, a liability. He is the kid that associating with costs you social capital. He is weepy and anxious and prone to very loud expressions of very small emotions, and he is completely, utterly devoted to Bart in the way that only the truest friends are devoted, which is without any expectation of receiving something equivalent in return. And Bart keeps him. Bart protects him imperfectly, inconsistently, in ways that often look like exploitation but contain a genuine core of care. Bart needs Milhouse not as a sidekick but as evidence. Evidence that the tough, indifferent exterior is a choice rather than a nature. That somewhere in Bart Simpson is a kid who is capable of loyalty, of warmth, of caring about a person who gives him nothing back in terms of status or social advantage. Bart doesn't stay friends with Milhouse because it benefits him. He stays friends with Milhouse because Milhouse sees him. Not the troublemaker, not the underachiever, not the wrong Simpson. The person underneath, the boy who draws and schemes and rebels not because he doesn't care, but because caring too much in the wrong direction has always gotten him hurt. That is Bart Simpson. 10 years old, always 10 years old, skateboard in hand, bouncing between the performance of not caring and the reality of caring deeply about a world that has consistently failed to care back. There are episodes that the show almost doesn't want you to notice because they contradict the dominant narrative of Bart as the irredeemable troublemaker. Bart the Genius is the very first episode after the pilot, and it establishes something the show never quite commits to but never quite abandons. Bart is perceptive about other people in ways that no one around him acknowledges. He cheats on the intelligence test by switching papers with Martin Prince, which is not a stupid plan. It is a plan that required identifying an opportunity, assessing risk, executing cleanly under pressure, and managing the aftermath. The plan works. Bart is enrolled in a school for gifted children, and he is miserable. Not because he's out of his depth. He is out of his depth academically, but the misery isn't about the coursework. It's about the discovery that there is no environment. Not the regular school that dismisses him, not the gifted school that doesn't recognize him, where Bart Simpson is the right shape. The places that would accept his intelligence don't accept his energy. The places that accept his energy don't accept his intelligence. There is no room for both at once. That is the specific torture of Bart's situation. He is not actually a bad student. He is a student who is bad in the context of every educational structure Springfield has to offer, which is a different problem entirely. Consider what Bart does when he has access to something that genuinely interests him. He becomes competent at a rate that would be remarkable in someone twice his age. He learns to play the drums in a matter of weeks and achieves a level of proficiency that gets him into a band. He picks up street performance skills, joke-telling, physical comedy, audience management, the ability to read a room and respond in real time, with a speed and a naturalness that his performing father Krusty, who makes a living at it, could study. He learns to skateboard to a level that most adults could not achieve regardless of effort, purely through repetition and the particular determination of a child who has found the one thing that makes the physical world reliably navigable. When Bart cares about something, Bart is extraordinary at it. The problem is that nothing Springfield offers to a 10-year-old to care about is worth caring about. The education system is inadequate. The extracurricular options are limited. The adult models available to him are, with a few exceptions, people who have already been defeated by the environment and settled into whatever shape the defeat left them in. Bart looks around at the adults of Springfield and sees his father, who is kind but cognitively limited, his principal, who is psychologically trapped in a borrowed identity, his teacher, who has been ground down by decades of classrooms full of children like him, and his employer's father's boss, who is a century-old vampire in a nuclear facility. The mentors aren't there. The models aren't there. The structures that would take Bart's specific, electric, creative, disruptive intelligence and give it somewhere to go rather than somewhere to crash haven't been built in Springfield. They exist elsewhere. They exist in cities and institutions and communities that are not saturated with the particular combination of radiation and poverty and institutional failure and collective denial that defines Springfield. Bart can't get there. He is 10 years old. He has a skateboard and a slingshot and Milhouse, and he will be 10 years old forever, and the skateboard is the only thing going anywhere. He is 10 years old, and he has been 10 years old for 36 years, and he will be 10 years old forever. And the question that stays with you, the one that arrives when you're lying in the dark and the show has been on in the background long enough for your guard to come down, is whether that is a tragedy or a mercy. Whether being frozen at 10 before the disappointments calcify into permanent limitations, before the gap between who you wanted to be and who you became is too wide to look across, whether staying 10 forever is the cruelest thing that happened to Bart Simpson or the kindest. The loop doesn't answer. The loop just keeps running. Section 4. Lisa Simpson, the loneliest person in Springfield. Lisa Simpson is 8 years old, and she is the most isolated character on the show. Not the saddest, though she is often sad. Not the most damaged, though there is damage there, real damage. The kind that doesn't announce itself but shapes everything. The most isolated. The most fundamentally alone in the specific way that very intelligent people in environments that weren't built for them tend to be alone, which is not the absence of people, but the presence of a gap between yourself and everyone around you that you can see clearly and they cannot see at all. She plays the saxophone. This detail is not incidental. It's not a character trait the writers added because they needed something to distinguish her from the rest of the family. It is the central fact of Lisa Simpson's interior life. The saxophone is the only place in Springfield where Lisa's need to express something real, something felt rather than performed, something that comes from the interior rather than the response to exterior expectation, is met without resistance. You cannot argue with a saxophone. You cannot dismiss it or grade it below average or tell it that it would do better if it just applied itself differently. You play it and the sound either carries what you're trying to say or it doesn't, and the judgment belongs entirely to you. Lisa plays the saxophone the way some people pray, as a private communication between the self and something larger, conducted in a language that bypasses the inadequacy of ordinary speech. She is a genius. The show establishes this so consistently that it becomes background noise, part of the wallpaper of who Lisa is. And like most things that become background noise in Springfield, we stop actually looking at it. But look at it for a moment. An 8-year-old with a tested IQ that places her at the outermost edge of the measurable range, living in a house with a father who has an IQ of 55 and a brother who uses his own intelligence primarily to generate increasingly elaborate pranks in a town whose population has been, if the radiation theory is to be believed, cognitively compromised by decades of nuclear exposure. Lisa Simpson is the smartest person in Springfield. Not the smartest child, the smartest person. She knows more than her teachers. She understands more than the adults around her. She sees patterns and implications and consequences that are invisible to everyone sharing her immediate environment. And she has been carrying the weight of that knowledge in a context where it is almost entirely useless since the age of 8, which is the age she has always been. The isolation this creates is particular and profound. It is not social awkwardness, exactly, though Lisa has that too. It is the specific, exhausting experience of knowing something important and having no one to tell it to. Of looking at the three-eyed fish in the river and understanding immediately what it means, and turning to the people around her and finding blank faces, comfortable faces, faces that have made their peace with not knowing and do not intend to be disturbed. Lisa has been disturbing people who don't want to be disturbed since before she could walk. She is a vegetarian in a town that holds an annual chili festival as a cultural celebration. She is an environmentalist in a town whose primary industry is a nuclear power plant with 342 safety violations. She is a Buddhist in a community that attends the Reverend Lovejoy's church primarily as a social obligation with no particular spiritual content. She is a pacifist, a feminist, an activist. She reads books that people in Springfield use primarily as physical objects to gesture at rather than sources of information. Every one of these is a correct position. Every one of them is, by any reasonable ethical measure, the right stance to take. And every one of them makes Lisa more isolated in Springfield. Because Springfield does not reward correct positions. Springfield rewards comfortable ones. There is an episode, Separate Vocations, in which Lisa briefly abandons her academic identity and becomes essentially a disciplinarian, a hall monitor who enforces rules with the same ruthless efficiency she normally applies to understanding them. And the show presents this as a deviation, an aberration, something wrong. But watch it again with fresh eyes and you can see something else. You can see a child who is exhausted by the weight of being the moral conscience of her family and her town, who wants, for a little while, to not be the one who has to be right about everything. Who wants to operate within a system rather than constantly critiquing it. Who wants the approval that comes with enforcement rather than the resistance that comes with challenging. The reversion to her academic self is framed as recovery. But the experiment reveals something the show doesn't quite want to sit with. Lisa's activism, her relentless commitment to being on the right side of every question, is also, in part, a performance. A performance built on genuine conviction, yes, but also on the deep human need to matter, to be necessary, to be the person whose contribution cannot be replicated by someone less capable. If Lisa stops being brilliant, stops being right, stops being the voice of reason and ethics and environmental consciousness in Springfield, what is she, just another 8-year-old in a town that doesn't particularly value 8-year-olds? Her intelligence is her identity because her identity, in the context of Springfield, doesn't have room to be much else. She has one real friend, Janie Powell, who functions primarily as a social placeholder, present enough to make Lisa not technically friendless, but not close enough to constitute the kind of companionship that Lisa actually needs. There was Ralph Wiggum, briefly, in the Valentine's Day episode, and the way Lisa handled that, the cruelty she was capable of when a relationship became inconvenient, is one of the show's most honest portraits of how even genuinely kind people can be brutal when their own isolation makes them clumsy with other people's feelings. The episode where this is depicted most clearly is I Love Lisa, and it is devastating in the quiet, precise way that the best Simpsons episodes are devastating. Lisa gives Ralph a Valentine out of pity, and Ralph falls completely, helplessly in love, and Lisa, uncomfortable, unable to be kind in the right register at the right time, tells him on camera at the Krusty Valentine's special that she never liked him. You can see the exact moment Ralph's heart breaks. The show makes you watch it in slow motion, and Lisa is not a villain in that moment. She is a child who doesn't know how to be loved by the wrong person without it feeling like a prison. She is a child who has been, for her entire life, in environments that don't fit, and who has not yet developed the emotional vocabulary for navigating that with grace. She will develop it eventually, or she would if the show ever let her grow up. But it doesn't. And she is 8 years old, and the saxophone is still the only truly reliable place. The dark theory of Lisa Simpson is not that something terrible was done to her. It is that something wonderful was done to her at the wrong address. She was given a mind that is genuinely extraordinary, that sees and understands and synthesizes and creates, and it was placed in Springfield, in a town that the radiation theory tells us has been cognitively flattened by decades of nuclear contamination. In a house with Homer and Bart. In a school with teachers who are mediocre at best and negligent at worst. In a community that consistently, reflexively, almost constitutionally resists exactly the kind of clear-eyed examination that Lisa's mind exists to perform. She is a telescope aimed at a wall. She is a tool perfectly designed for a purpose that Springfield has no use for. And the cruelest part of the dark theory is this. Under the floating timeline, Lisa will always be 8. She will never get out. She will never go to college, never find her people, never discover that there are places in the world where a mind like hers is not a burden, but a currency. She will always be 8 and always be alone and always be playing her saxophone in the living room of a house in Springfield while the water from the tap carries the invisible signature of the leaking reactor, and the person in the next room doesn't notice, and the fish downstream have 3 eyes and nobody asks why. Unless the coma theory is true. Unless Lisa is a dream. In which case, Homer made her. In which case, the most brilliant person in Springfield is the creation of the man with the IQ of 55. And that is either the most beautiful thing in the entire show or the most heartbreaking, and in the particular emotional mathematics of Springfield, it is almost certainly both. There is one more dimension to Lisa's dark theory that deserves its own space because it is the one that arrives last and stays longest. Lisa is 8 years old. She will always be 8 years old. And she is spending those 8 years doing something that no 8-year-old should have to do, which is bearing the moral weight of an entire town. The show has given Lisa every important social cause of the last 3 decades. Environmentalism, animal rights, vegetarianism, gender equality, racial justice, political accountability, economic fairness. Lisa has been the character through whom the show engages with almost every significant ethical question it has ever touched, and she has been doing this since before she could ride a bike reliably. The weight of that is not trivial. There is a particular exhaustion that belongs to people who see injustice clearly and feel obligated to name it, who cannot pass a problem without identifying it, who cannot be in a room with a wrong without trying to make it right. The exhaustion is not noble suffering in the sense that the sufferer would prefer the alternative. The exhaustion is just the cost of being built the way Lisa is built, in a place that was not designed for the kind of person she is. She argues with teachers, she challenges authority. She writes papers that no one asks for and gives speeches that no one requested, and holds the line on principles that her family treats as conversational obstacles rather than moral commitments. And she does this every day, every episode, for 36 years, while remaining 8 years old, while never accumulating the weight of experience that would either harden her or break her, or give her the particular resilience that only comes from having actually survived something. She is perpetually at the beginning. She is always in the first day of the fight, when the energy is still there, but before you have developed the specific thick skin that the fight requires for long-term survival. She cannot develop that skin because the loop resets. Every episode, she is 8 years old again, without the calluses, without the armor, without the knowledge of how many of these fights she has already had and lost. She is the most durable idealist in the history of television, not because she is strong, but because she cannot be allowed to tire. Springfield will not let her age, and aging is the only thing that teaches idealists when to stop. If that is a mercy, it is a mercy that looks, from the inside, exactly like imprisonment. She is 8 years old, and she is brilliant, and she is alone, and the saxophone is still the best conversation she's had all day. Section 5. Maggie Simpson, the most dangerous mind in the room. Maggie Simpson does not speak. She has been not speaking for 36 years. She sits in her high chair, or rides in her stroller, or crawls across the linoleum of the kitchen floor, and she watches everything. And she says nothing. And the family moves around her like she is furniture. Like she is a very small, very yellow piece of the domestic background, present and accounted for and requiring maintenance, but not, in any meaningful sense, a participant in what is happening around her. This is the greatest mistake the Simpson family has ever made. The evidence for what Maggie actually is beneath the pacifier and the enormous eyes and the practiced performance of helpless infancy is scattered across 36 years of episodes like breadcrumbs, dropped by someone who wasn't entirely sure they wanted to be found. But the breadcrumbs are there, and if you follow them, if you trace the path they mark through the accumulated history of the show, you arrive at a conclusion so specific and so unsettling that it tends to sit with you for a while after the episode ends. Maggie Simpson is the most intelligent person in Springfield. Not potentially, not in some theoretical developmental sense, not she will be when she grows up. Right now, at 1 year old, in the high chair, with the pacifier and the vacant stare she deploys with the precision of a professional, Maggie Simpson is operating at a cognitive level that no one around her has come close to achieving. We have discussed this in terms of what she has done. The shooting, which, whether or not she was the actual shooter, demonstrates a level of situational awareness and strategic silence that goes far beyond what any infant should possess. The daycare rebellion, which required planning, coordination, the ability to organize a group toward a shared objective, and the execution of a multi-stage plan under significant logistical constraint. These are documented moments, on-screen events, canonical evidence. But the darker theory is not about what Maggie has done. It's about why she hasn't done more. Or more precisely, why she has been so careful to make it appear that she hasn't. Look at Lisa. Look at what Lisa's intelligence has cost her. Look at the isolation, the resistance, the constant uphill battle of being the smartest person in a room that resents being made to feel its own inadequacy. Lisa uses her intelligence openly, loudly, persistently. She wears it on the outside. She announces it with every question she asks and every truth she tells and every injustice she refuses to ignore. And the room responds, consistently, by closing around her like water around a stone. Maggie watched this happen from birth. She has had a ringside seat to the entire education of Lisa Simpson, including the expensive, painful lessons about what intelligence costs when it's deployed without camouflage in an environment that was not built to receive it. And Maggie being the entity that the evidence suggests is operating at a level beyond what the show's own metrics can capture, drew the obvious conclusion. Don't be seen. Don't be known. Don't announce. Don't engage. Observe everything, reveal nothing, and wait for the moment when visibility is an advantage rather than a liability. The pacifier is the masterstroke. It is such an effective piece of misdirection that even the audience, even the people who have been watching for years and who know intellectually that Maggie is unusual, tend to underestimate her. Because the pacifier is the prop of helplessness. It is the signal that this is a baby, that this creature requires care and supervision and gentle management, that whatever is happening in the mind behind those enormous eyes is probably simple and reflexive and not worth worrying about. And Maggie never removes it in front of anyone. The checking of her surroundings in the final shot of the Who Shot Mr. Burns episode is the clearest expression of what Maggie actually is. She is alone. She looks left. She looks right. She confirms that the room is empty. And then, and only then, she reenacts the shooting. A deliberate, controlled gesture. A private celebration or rehearsal or act of remembrance conducted in strict secrecy, with a level of situational awareness and caution that no baby who is actually a baby would exhibit. That sequence of behaviors, awareness of observation, assessment of privacy, deliberate action, tells you everything. It tells you that Maggie knows she is being watched. It tells you that she has decided what information to reveal to observers and what to keep. It tells you that she is running an active strategy of concealment that has been in operation since before she could walk. The question the dark theory poses about Maggie is not what has she done. It is what is she waiting for, because Maggie is patient. The patience is the most frightening thing about her. 36 years of silence. 36 years of watching. Of sitting in the high chair while the family falls apart and reassembles and falls apart again. While Homer has his disasters, and Bart has his rebellions, and Lisa has her battles with a world that doesn't want to hear her, and Maggie absorbs all of it. What does she learn? She learns the specific vulnerabilities of every person in the family. She learns Homer's blind spots, which are many and wide. She learns the limits of Marge's patience, the exact pressure points that make Marge's composure fracture. She learns where Bart's bravado hollows out, the places underneath the misbehavior where the scared child lives. She learns Lisa's loneliness, the particular shape of it, the places where a word said at the right moment by someone who actually saw her would matter enormously. She learns all of this and she says nothing, because saying something would reveal that she knows it. And revealing that she knows it would change the dynamics of the house, would make her visible in a way that her strategy explicitly requires her not to be. There is also the radioactive angle, which we mentioned briefly when discussing Homer and which deserves expansion here. If Springfield's contaminated water and air produce mutations, and if those mutations don't proceed uniformly but interact with whatever biological predispositions each individual brings to the exposure, then the variation between Homer and Maggie represents the extreme poles of a distribution. Homer's exposure, combined with the crayon and the childhood abandonment and decades at the power plant, pushed him toward the lower bound. Maggie's exposure, beginning in utero and continuing through the only infancy she has ever had, pushed her somewhere else entirely. The mutation amplified something in the neural architecture of whatever organism Maggie is developing toward. Something that, in a normal exposure at a normal dose over a normal developmental timeline, would produce a highly intelligent adult. But in Springfield, at these doses, on this timeline, has produced something that doesn't fit any conventional developmental category. She is 1 year old and she is the smartest person in the room. She is 1 year old and she will remain 1 year old forever. She is 1 year old and she has been strategically silent for 36 years while building a comprehensive intelligence portrait of every person who has ever underestimated her. Springfield won't see it coming. That's the design. Section 6, Mr. Burns, the monster who built the cage. Charles Montgomery Burns is the oldest man in Springfield. He might be the oldest man in America. He walks with a cane that he does not strictly need, bent forward at an angle that suggests the weight of the decades pressing down on his spine, his arms extended in front of him in that characteristic gesture that looks like he is always in the process of summoning something. His voice is the voice of another era, thin and precise and carrying the specific cadences of a man who learned to speak in a century that no longer exists. He remembers things that happened before the people around him were born, and he remembers them not as historical facts, but as personal experiences, as events he was present for, that left marks on him the way events leave marks on someone who was actually there. The show has never committed to an exact age for Burns. What it has committed to is the overwhelming implication that the number would be unnerving if stated directly. He attended Yale, he served in a world war, he has referenced personal memories from the Gilded Age. He knew people who died before most of the 20th century had happened. The conservative estimate, the one that requires the fewest leaps, places his birth somewhere in the late 1800s, which means he is, at minimum, in his late hundreds. And he is not just alive, he functions. He runs a multi-billion-dollar corporation. He manipulates municipal politics. He plans and schemes and remembers everything. How? The Springfield Files gives us the most direct answer the show ever offers. And it offers it as a joke. As an aside, in an episode nominally about alien sightings, which is either the most elegant piece of misdirection in the show's history or evidence that the writers didn't fully understand what they had created. Burns undergoes a weekly medical treatment that is so intensive, so saturated with chemicals and radiation that it causes his body to emit a visible green glow for the duration of the recovery period. The treatment keeps him alive for exactly 7 more days. Without it, he dies. He wanders out of the facility in a dazed, euphoric state, luminous in the dark, stumbling through the woods near Springfield. And the people of the town see this glowing figure, and their first instinct, their absolute first response, is that it must be an alien. Not the power plant, not their employer who has been alive for over a century and walks with a cane and regards human beings with the specific detachment of someone who has watched enough of them die to stop finding it particularly notable. An alien from outer space. The denial required to reach that conclusion is so thick, so established, so architectural, that it functions almost as a testament to how effectively Burns has shaped the cognitive environment of Springfield. Because Burns knows exactly what he is. He knows exactly what the treatments are doing. He is not confused about his own condition. He is the most medically sophisticated person in Springfield, not because he went to medical school, though his private physicians almost certainly did, but because his survival has depended, for over a century, on understanding what radiation does to biological systems. He is an expert in the mechanics of his own preservation, and he is an expert in what happens when that preservation is absent, what radiation does to the bodies of people who don't have access to the weekly treatments, to the private medical infrastructure, to the pharmaceutical division that synthesizes whatever experimental compound is keeping his disease equilibrium stable. He knows what it does because Springfield is his data set. This is the central horror of the Burns theory. Not that he is old, not that he uses extraordinary medical interventions to sustain a lifespan that should have ended before the First World War, but that the town he poisoned is his laboratory. The three-eyed fish is his data. The yellow skin and the bulging eyes and the 4 fingers and Homer's IQ of 55 are his results. He has been running this experiment for decades, and the experiment continues because the experiment is also his business model. Because a cognitively compromised population makes for a perfectly compliant workforce. Because the man whose job it is to prevent radioactive leaks is a man with a crayon in his brain and an IQ that places him in the clinical disability range. Burns did not accidentally create the conditions of Springfield. He engineered them. And he maintains them with the same precise, scheduled care with which he maintains his own biology. His relationship with Smithers illuminates the machinery of this. Smithers manages Burns's medical schedule. Smithers ensures every treatment happens on time, because missing one is not an inconvenience. It is a death sentence. Smithers monitors Burns's physical condition with a vigilance that borders on obsession, and has long since crossed into something more complicated and more codependent than mere professional loyalty. Smithers is not devoted to Burns because Burns is good. Burns is not good. Smithers has extensive, direct, first-hand knowledge of exactly how not good Burns is. He has been present for the cruelties, the indifferences, the casual destruction of other people's lives that Burns has conducted from his desk in the nuclear power plant for the entirety of their professional relationship. Smithers is devoted to Burns despite all of this, or more precisely, because despite all of this, Burns is the organizing principle of Smithers' existence. Without Burns, Smithers has no function. Without Burns, the careful architecture of Smithers' daily life, the schedule, the appointments, the management of the man and the machine, collapses. And there is the other thing, the thing the show treats with more tenderness than most of its darker material. Smithers loves Burns, actually loves him, in whatever private, complicated, never quite examined way that the show has been gesturing toward for 36 years. And Burns, for all his monstrous qualities, is aware of this and has decided that it is useful. Not reciprocated, useful. The wealth and the longevity and the power are all one system, all feeding each other in the closed loop of Burns's continued existence. The power plant generates revenue. The revenue funds the treatments. The treatments sustain the body. The body remains in control of the power plant. The plant continues to poison Springfield. The poisoned population remains compliant. The compliant population continues to staff the plant. The plant generates revenue. He is not immortal. He has said this himself, in his way. He is too expensive to die. There is a difference, and it matters. Immortality is a natural condition, a biological fact, something that exists independent of resources and planning. What Burns has is different. What Burns has is a system, an infrastructure of survival that he has spent over a century constructing, that requires constant maintenance, constant funding, constant vigilance to sustain. If the money stops, he dies. If the treatments stop, he dies. If Smithers is unavailable for long enough, he dies. He is not beyond mortality. He is simply built with the extraordinary resources available to someone of his particular combination of intelligence and ruthlessness and wealth, a structure that keeps mortality at a distance. And the structure, because it requires the power plant to function economically, requires Springfield to remain exactly as it is. Ignorant, compliant, too irradiated to ask the right questions, too economically dependent on the single employer the town has ever had to risk antagonizing him. Springfield cannot kill Burns because Springfield needs Burns. That is not an accident. That is the blueprint. He had a son once. Larry Burns, who appeared in one episode and was revealed to be given up for adoption when Burns was young, before the wealth was fully established. Larry returned. They had a reunion. It went poorly. Burns looked at his adult son, who had turned out cheerful and warm and fundamentally kind, and found him incomprehensible. Incompatible with the version of the Burns legacy that had been constructed in Larry's absence. And Larry, being Larry, walked away without lasting damage, which is more than can be said for most of the people who get close to his father. The moment is telling. Burns had an opportunity to be something other than what he is, or to acknowledge that something other than what he is possible, even within the Burns biological line. He declined. The system was more important than the possibility. That is Burns in 4 words. The system over the possibility, the machine over the person, the experiment over the subjects. He is the monster who built the cage, and the monster who built the cage is also the monster in the cage, because Burns, for all his power, for all his longevity, for all his resources, is as trapped in Springfield as anyone else. He cannot leave his treatments behind. He cannot survive without Smithers. He cannot exist in a world that does not provide him with the weekly dose. He is chained to Springfield as surely as Homer is, by different chains, much more comfortable chains, chains made of gold rather than radiation. But chains are chains. There is one more layer to the Burns theory that the show introduces and then lets sit without fully developing, which is the question of what he actually wants. Burns is a villain in the classical sense. He is comprehensible as a villain. He wants money, power, control, the perpetuation of the systems that sustain all 3. He is rational in his pursuit of these things. He is strategic and patient and almost entirely without sentiment in his operational decisions. But there are episodes where something different emerges, where the man underneath the machine becomes briefly, uncomfortably visible. When he falls in love with Marge, when he befriends Homer, and the friendship, ridiculous and asymmetric and fundamentally incapable of surviving contact with the reality of their respective positions, is nonetheless real in the moment. When he is confronted with the human cost of his decisions, and something on his face suggests for just a second that he is not entirely insulated from that cost. Burns was a child once. The show has shown us this in sepia-toned flashbacks, in the strange, haunted quality of his oldest memories. He was given away. His family, wealthy and indifferent, handed him to a billionaire even wealthier and even more indifferent. And the transaction made Burns what he was. It took a child who might have been something and redirected him toward an archetype, toward the function of accumulation, toward the purpose of maintaining and extending the Burns legacy, toward the role that had been prepared for him before he was old enough to know he had other options. That child is still in there somewhere. Underneath the centuries, underneath the treatments and the decay and the cruelty and the comprehensive indifference to human suffering. The child who was given away is still there at the bottom of everything, and the empire he has spent over a century building is, if you follow the logic of it all the way down, his response to that transaction. He was given away because he wasn't worth keeping. He built an empire to prove the calculation wrong. And the empire requires Springfield and the treatments and the compliant workforce and the three-eyed fish, and all of it requires the entire machine to keep running, because the moment the machine stops, he has to sit in the silence and find out if the empire was worth it. He won't do that. The machine keeps running, and Springfield keeps paying, and somewhere in the locked and carefully maintained interior of Charles Montgomery Burns, the child who was given away for money has been waiting for over a century to find out if any of this has made him worth keeping. The answer the machine provides is never quite sufficient. That's why it has to keep running. Section 7. Ned Flanders. The man who was programmed to smile, Ned Flanders is, by any objective measure, a better person than Homer Simpson. He is financially responsible in a way that Homer, who has destroyed the family finances on more occasions than can be reasonably cataloged, simply is not. He is physically disciplined. He is present for his children. He is generous with his time and his resources and his neighborly attention to an extent that borders on compulsive. He is, by the metrics that most people use to evaluate character, a genuinely good man, and Springfield punishes him for it. Constantly, comprehensively, without mercy and without pattern in ways large and small, the universe of The Simpsons has arranged itself to ensure that Ned Flanders receives approximately none of the return that his investment in goodness seems to have earned. His wife is dead. Maude Flanders, who was herself genuinely kind and genuinely pleasant, and as far as the show ever established, was a good mother and a good person, died because Homer was too selfish to catch a t-shirt. That is the canonical explanation. A t-shirt cannon misfired during a NASCAR event. The shirts were aimed at Homer. Homer dodged. Maude took the impact. The gentle, church-going wife of the most devout man in Springfield died as a direct consequence of Homer Simpson's reflexive self-preservation. And Ned forgave him. Not performatively, not as a public gesture of spiritual superiority. Ned Flanders actually, genuinely, in the private architecture of his soul, forgave Homer for the death of his wife. Because that is what Ned does. Because forgiveness is not a choice for Ned, the way it is for other people. For other people, forgiveness is something you arrive at after grief and anger and the slow, difficult work of deciding that the weight of resentment is not worth carrying. For Ned, forgiveness is what happens automatically, the way a thermostat responds to temperature, because the rage that forgiveness is usually required to replace was conditioned out of him before he was old enough to choose. This is the Flanders episode, and it is the episode that changes everything about how you understand Ned. In Hurricane Nettie, the community rebuilds Ned's house after a storm destroys it. The rebuild is spectacularly incompetent, the kind of well-meaning disaster that happens when people who care about you lack the skills to help you properly. The house collapses immediately, and Ned, who has been absorbing this kind of thing for years, who has responded to every indignity and loss and failure and disappointment with the same patient, measured Christian forbearance, simply cracks. He screams at the town, he says, out loud, every true thing he has been keeping carefully internalized. He calls people by their actual qualities, rather than the charitable interpretations he has been applying for decades. He is furious and precise, and for about 60 seconds of screen time, he is more honest than he has ever been in the show's history. And then he is institutionalized. The episode sends Ned to a psychiatric facility where the backstory is revealed. His parents were beatniks who didn't believe in discipline. Young Ned was a terror. Not a normal childhood mischief terror. A genuinely uncontrollable child, violent and explosive, and without the internal regulatory mechanisms that allow people to function in social environments. His parents, recognizing the problem but lacking the philosophical framework to address it through conventional discipline, took him to a psychiatrist. And the psychiatrist spent years, through behavioral modification, systematic and thorough, conditioning the aggression out of Ned's behavioral repertoire. The conditioning worked. The rage is still there, buried deep, maintained under enormous pressure by the psychological architecture the psychiatrist built around it. The hurricane episode is what happens when that architecture is stressed past its tolerance limits. When the thing underneath gets close enough to the surface that even the conditioning can't keep it down. The psychiatrist treats Ned's current breakdown with more of the same, more behavioral conditioning. The classic therapy approach, which is essentially a reset, bringing the suppression mechanisms back online and sending Ned back out into the world. Back to the house on Evergreen Terrace. Back to neighborly interactions with Homer. Back to church and the Flanders boys and the Leftorium, and the smile that is now, in the aftermath of this episode, impossible to look at quite the same way. Because you know what's behind the smile now. The episode told you. The smile is a cage, a beautifully constructed, professionally maintained psychological cage built around a child who couldn't be allowed to be what he actually was, and which now contains an adult who has never been allowed to find out what he actually is. And God doesn't talk to him. This is the most devastating detail in the entire dark theory of Ned Flanders, and it's delivered so casually that it's easy to miss. Homer has spoken to God several times. God appears, has a conversation with Homer, offers opinions and observations, and in at least one instance, direct theological comfort. Homer, who sleeps through church, who treats religious observance as a social obligation at best, and an inconvenience at worst, has a personal, conversational relationship with the divine that most clergymen would envy. Ned Flanders, who has organized his entire life around his faith, who attends church every Sunday with his children, and takes the teaching seriously and prays and tithes and attempts, at genuine personal cost, to live the values his religion endorses, has never once had God appear and speak to him directly in the show. The drunk gets the vision. The devout gets silence. There is a theological tradition in which this kind of apparent divine indifference to sincere faith is treated as its own kind of test, its own deeper form of faithfulness. The dark night of the soul endured by mystics through the centuries. But that interpretation requires a framework in which the silence has meaning, in which the absence of divine communication is itself a form of presence. The Simpsons is not that kind of show. The silence is not a test. It is the show telling you, with the particular bluntness of satire, that goodness is not what the system rewards. That the architecture of Springfield, whether it's the radiation or the corruption or the collective denial or simply the way the universe is constructed within the show's logic, does not distribute its comforts according to desert. Homer falls into God's conversation the way Homer falls into everything, stumbling, inadvertent, undeserving by any conventional metric. And God is there. Ned walks to church on Sunday with his boys, and the church is quiet, in the particular way that churches are quiet when the person inside them is the only one listening. His second wife, Edna Krabappel, deserves mention here because her death, and the aftermath of it, added another layer to the Flanders theory. Edna was voiced by Marcia Wallace, who died in 2013. The show retired the character. It gave Ned one more loss. Bart Simpson, who had been the bane of Edna's professional existence for years, who had made her life more difficult in small ways, more consistently than perhaps any single other person, drew a memorial on the classroom chalkboard. He won't keep it down. I think I'll miss her. In the specific emotional grammar of The Simpsons, that is grief. That is what grief looks like in this town. Quiet and sideways and drawn in chalk on a board that will be erased by the next episode because nothing in Springfield stays. And Ned buried another one. And kept going and smiled. The dark theory of Ned Flanders is not that he is unhappy exactly, though he is. It is not that his goodness is false, though it is, in part, constructed rather than chosen. The dark theory is that Ned Flanders represents the show's most honest engagement with a question it usually avoids. What happens to good people when the system they believe in doesn't care about them? And the answer, delivered through 36 years of Ned's story, is this. They keep going, they keep trying, they absorb the losses and bury the rage and go back to church on Sunday. Not because they're strong exactly, because the alternative, acknowledging that the goodness isn't being rewarded, that the system isn't just, that the faith might be misplaced, would require dismantling an interior architecture that is holding something very dangerous, very carefully in check. Ned Flanders is good because the alternative is something he was conditioned, before he was old enough to consent, never to be. And that is either the kindest thing his parents ever did for him or the cruelest, depending on how you count the things that kindness costs. Section 8. Mona and Abe Simpson. The conspiracy that made Homer. Homer Simpson's parents made him who he is. Not in the vague, general sense that all parents shape all children. In the specific, traceable, directly causal sense that the decisions Mona and Abraham Simpson made in the late 1960s in Springfield, while Homer was too young to understand what was happening, built the exact psychological profile that Burns needed, occupying the safety inspector's chair at the nuclear power plant 30 years later. Whether that outcome was engineered or accidental depends on how much credit you are prepared to give to one elderly billionaire's capacity for long-range planning. Abe Simpson is a difficult figure to sit with because the show has always encouraged you to find him funny rather than troubling. He is the cranky old man who tells incomprehensible stories to anyone who will slow down long enough to be trapped by them. He is the nursing home resident who has been abandoned there by his son and who responds to the abandonment with a combination of complaint and resignation that is very recognizable as very old man behavior. He is a joke about the way American families treat their elderly, about the specific particular loneliness of people who were central to everything and are now peripheral to everything. But underneath the joke, Abe Simpson is a man who told his son his mother was dead. Told him. Chose to tell him. Looked at a child of 6 who was already confused and frightened and incomplete, who had already lost his mother, who needed some kind of truth to hold on to, and gave him a lie. Showed him a grave. Stood beside the headstone of a poet whose name he had borrowed for the occasion and said, "Your mother is in there." This is where she went. Why? The official story, the one the show provides, is that Abe was protecting Homer, that the truth about Mona, her activist past, her fugitive status, the FBI pursuit that had made her impossible for the family to acknowledge, was too dangerous to share with a child. That telling Homer his mother was alive and on the run would have given him something to grieve toward rather than away from. A loss that was perpetually unresolved. A door left open in the worst possible way. The lie was cleaner. The lie allowed Homer to grieve and move on. The lie gave him an ending. This reasoning is internally consistent and also monstrous in its specific application because the ending it gave Homer was the ending of believing himself abandoned. The ending of understanding his mother's disappearance not as something that happened to the family, but as something that reflected on him, something he had done or failed to be that made his mother choose to go. Children are very good at becoming the explanation for adult decisions they don't understand. Especially young children, especially children whose parents are unavailable or absent, or wrapped in their own grief and guilt in ways that make them emotionally inaccessible. Homer was 6 years old and his mother was gone and his father was cold and had never been warm. And the conclusion a child's brain draws in that environment, the conclusion that Homer almost certainly drew, is the most obvious one. It was something about me. I wasn't enough. There is something wrong with me that makes the people I love leave. Abe let him carry that for decades, through Homer's entire childhood, through his adolescence, through his early adulthood, through his marriage to Marge, through the birth of his own children. Homer Simpson built his entire emotional architecture on a foundation of maternal abandonment that was not actually abandonment, and Abe watched him do it and said nothing. When Homer finally discovers his mother is alive, in the episode Mother Simpson, the reunion is one of the show's genuinely beautiful moments. Glenn Close voices Mona with a warmth and an ache that makes the years of absence feel real. And the scene between Homer and his mother, two people who have been separated by lies and circumstance for the better part of 3 decades, reaching for each other across the gap of all that lost time, is as emotionally honest as the show has ever been. But the reunion is brief. Burns spots Mona. Burns calls the FBI, and Mona has to run again. Homer watches her go, again. For the second time in his life, he watches his mother disappear, and this time he knows why, and knowing why is somehow worse than not knowing. Because now he knows who to be angry at, and he works for that person, and he cannot afford to be angry at that person, because the job is all he has. The theory that builds from this is one of the show's most completely architected dark readings. Burns did not destroy Homer incidentally, as a side effect of his pursuit of Mona. Burns destroyed Homer deliberately, as part of a strategy for maintaining the kind of workforce that his power plant required. A compliant, uncritical, emotionally damaged workforce that would not ask questions, would not organize, would not look at the leaking reactor and make the obvious calculations about what it was doing to the people downstream. Mona threatened the biological weapons laboratory. Burns retaliated by turning her son into the precise instrument Burns needed at the nuclear facility. The retaliation was not conscious, perhaps. Burns did not drop a plan that said, "I will pursue this woman until she abandons her child, and the abandonment will shape the child into the uncritical employee I need." But the outcome is so perfect, so precisely calibrated to Burns's operational requirements, that it is difficult to attribute entirely to coincidence. And then Abe made a deal. The show reveals in a later season that Abe discovered Burns had committed a crime and held the evidence long enough to negotiate. Not for justice, not for accountability, for Homer's job security, for the guarantee that Homer, who had already been shaped by loss and radiation and a crayon in his brain into exactly the kind of non-threatening low-competence employee that Burns needed in Sector 7G, would have that job for the rest of his life. Could not be fired. Would always have the income, the structure, the bare minimum of economic stability that the job provided. It is an act that is simultaneously an act of love and an act of profound failure. Abe secured Homer's future. He did it by entering into a contractual relationship with the man who destroyed Homer's past. He did it without telling Homer. He did it in a way that ensured Homer would never understand why his job security existed, would never connect the permanence of his position to the history of his family's relationship with Burns, would never have the information he needed to understand the architecture of his own life. Abe gave Homer stability and took from him the possibility of clarity, the possibility of understanding what had actually happened to his family, of seeing the full shape of the conspiracy that had been running since before he was old enough to have opinions about it. Mona is the other half of the equation, and her half is both simpler and more painful. She did not abandon Homer. She kissed him while he slept and disappeared into the night, because staying would have put him in danger. The sacrifice was real. The love was real. And the consequence of the real sacrifice made from real love was that Homer spent 30 years believing himself unloved. Intentions do not travel. The love behind the departure did not arrive at its destination. What arrived was the departure itself. The empty room, the father who would not explain. The grave of a poet. When Mona finally dies in a later season, the scene is quiet. Homer holds her hand. There are no jokes. The show doesn't reach for the reset button, it lets them have the moment. A man and his mother in the space of all the years they didn't have, together for long enough to say goodbye before the show, takes her away again, permanently this time. The last departure in a life that was structured around departures. The conspiracy that made Homer is a tragedy in 3 generations. Mona fought the right battle and lost everything. Abe made the wrong deal and called it love. Homer inherited the consequences of both and was never equipped to understand them. 3 people, each doing what they believed was best, each making choices from within the limited perspective available to them, and the cumulative result is a man in a yellow house on Evergreen Terrace who falls asleep on the couch every evening without knowing why his life feels heavier than it should. That is not cartoon logic. That is just how things happen. Section 9. Groundskeeper Willie, Principal Skinner, and Sideshow Bob. The men Springfield broke. Springfield is full of people who arrived from somewhere else with something intact and left it with almost nothing. Groundskeeper Willie came from Scotland. This detail is deployed primarily for accent jokes, for the particular humor of an extremely Scottish man in an extremely American context. But underneath the jokes is a story that the show almost tells directly and then consistently pulls back from. Willie left Scotland. He came to Springfield. He maintains the grounds of an elementary school with a ferocity that suggests he is trying to keep something perfect in an environment that does not reward perfection. He lives in a shack on school property. The shack is the detail that stops being funny when you think about it too long. It is a structure that appears to be without plumbing, without adequate heat, attached physically to an educational institution in a way that suggests its occupant has no existence independent of his function. Willie does not live near the school. He lives at the school. He is, in some deep structural sense, part of the building, an appendage of the institution, unable or unwilling to separate himself from the only context in which he has a clear role. He has a past. The show glimpses at it in scattered episodes. A love story that ended badly, a family in Scotland that he either lost or left. A person he was before Springfield made him into the caricature with the enormous shoulders and the immediate resort to physical confrontation. That person still emerges occasionally in moments of genuine tenderness that the character reaches for across the comedy of his own presentation. He has protected children. He has been the adult in the room when the adults with official authority were absent or useless. He has demonstrated, in specific, quiet moments, that the rage and the eccentricity are armor, and underneath the armor is something that got hurt a long time ago and never quite healed in this climate. Willie is what happens when a person with genuine capability and genuine feeling is given no container for either. No institution that values what he can do, no community that acknowledges what he actually is. He is the groundskeeper. He maintains the grounds. His interior life is not the school's concern. Skinner is more complicated because Skinner's story has a specific shape that the show named explicitly once and then immediately tried to unsay. The episode is called The Principal and the Pauper, and what it reveals about Armin Tamzarian is, depending on your perspective, either a catastrophic continuity error or the most honest thing the show ever said about identity. Armin Tamzarian was nobody. He was a young man from nowhere, without family or prospects, or a sense of who he was supposed to become, who found himself in the military and found there a structure that, for the first time in his life, gave him context, told him who to be in relation to his environment, gave him a role that was clear and a set of expectations that were comprehensible and a community that, however hierarchical and demanding, was at least a community. Then the structure was removed. Seymour Skinner was captured. Tamzarian was alone, responsible for delivering the news of a death that wasn't entirely his to deliver, arriving in a town he had never seen to tell a woman he had never met that her son was gone. And the woman needed him to be her son. The moment when Tamzarian became Skinner is not a moment of deliberate fraud. It is a moment of desperate mutual accommodation. Two people who both needed something and found, in the gap between who they actually were and who they needed each other to be, something that worked. Agnes needed a son. Tamzarian needed a self. Springfield needed a principal. The pieces fit. 20 years later, when the real Skinner appears and the mechanism is exposed, the town doesn't vote to restore authenticity. It votes to maintain function. It votes for the version of Skinner that has been embedded in the institution, that has relationships and history and a known set of behavioral patterns, over the stranger who has truth on his side but nothing else. The real Skinner is exiled. The fake one goes back to work. And Tamzarian, who is now legally and by community consent Seymour Skinner, returns to the elementary school, to the relationship with Agnes, to the ongoing antagonism with Bart, to the military rigidity and the mother issues and the entire construction of an identity he built from scratch in someone else's town, using someone else's name. He is a man who has been living in a borrowed life for so long that the original owner's return felt like the intrusion rather than the homecoming. The dark theory of Skinner is that he knows. He has always known. He wakes up every morning in Seymour Skinner's life, and the knowledge is there, the bedrock knowledge that this is not who he is, that somewhere there is a record of who Armin Tamzarian was supposed to become, that the person looking back at him from the mirror has a borrowed name and a constructed history and a mother who would be devastated if she ever fully understood the terms of what she received. And he continues anyway, because this life, borrowed and contingent and perpetually provisional as it is the only one he has. Sideshow Bob is perhaps the character whose darkness is most visible, most openly acknowledged, most central to the humor. Bob is brilliant. Bob is educated. Bob is, in terms of raw intellectual capacity, the most sophisticated criminal mind the show has ever produced, which in Springfield means he is the most sophisticated mind in Springfield, full stop. He went to Yale. He has genuine cultural cultivation, a love of opera and literature and the classical arts that is not affected, that is not a pose, that is the actual expression of a genuine interior life that has more content and more texture than almost anyone else in the show. And he ended up as Krusty the Clown's sidekick. This is the original wound, the event that sets everything else in motion. Bob, who is capable of so much more, who knows he is capable of so much more, is employed as the assistant to a functionally illiterate entertainer, whose act relies entirely on elaborate physical comedy that Bob finds contemptible. He is brilliant, and he is invisible. And he is invisible in the specific, humiliating way that being necessary to someone more famous than you can make you invisible. His turn toward villainy, his first criminal act, is a political fraud in the service of a conservative agenda. But what it actually is underneath the politics is a statement, a declaration of existence, a refusal to remain invisible. If the legitimate channels of recognition and advancement are closed, if the world insists on organizing itself in ways that fail to acknowledge what Bob actually is, then Bob will organize it differently. He will impose himself on the world's attention by force of will and intelligence and criminal ingenuity. He will be noticed. He is noticed. By Bart Simpson. The 10-year-old who keeps catching him, who keeps exposing him, who keeps sending him back to prison through a combination of luck and the specific, infuriating intelligence of a child who has nothing to lose. Bob's feud with Bart is not irrational. It is the expression of a deeply rational frustration. He is being outwitted by a child, repeatedly. The most sophisticated intellect in Springfield is being thwarted consistently by a 10-year-old boy with a slingshot and no homework done. What does it mean that Springfield's most intelligent resident can't win against its most disruptive one? It means the system is not designed for intelligence to win, not even criminal intelligence. The system is designed for endurance, for the specific, dumb, bovine persistence of people like Homer, who simply will not die and will not leave and will not stop showing up, who take punishment that would break a sophisticated person and just get up and stumble forward. Intelligence in Springfield is a liability in direct proportion to how much of it you have. Bob has too much. It makes him elaborate. It makes him vulnerable to counter-complexity. It makes him, repeatedly and humiliatingly, the author of his own defeat. He is in prison again. He will escape again. He will construct another plan of extraordinary cleverness, and it will be foiled again by a child who doesn't know enough to know what he's up against. And Bob will go back to prison and read his books, and plan his next move and dream of a world that is organized the way it should be, the way his intelligence tells him it should be, where merit is recognized and sophistication is rewarded, and the brilliant man is not standing backstage while the clown takes the applause. That world does not exist in Springfield. That world may not exist anywhere. But Bob keeps looking for it because the alternative is accepting that the world as it is will never have a place for him. And that is not an acceptance that a mind like Bob's is built to make. Section 10. Hans Moleman, Barney Gumble, and Krusty. The Clown. The Forgotten Casualties. There are characters in Springfield who exist in the background, who populate scenes and fill spaces, and contribute to the ambient texture of the town without ever quite being the subject of the story, and the darkness of their theories is often in inverse proportion to how much attention the show pays to them. Hans Moleman is the most killed character in television history. Not killed in the sense of being written out. Killed in the literal sense of being depicted on screen in canonical episodes, dying. Being crushed, being struck by vehicles, being incinerated, being eaten, being subjected to lethal physical trauma that the show depicts with matter-of-fact visual clarity, and then immediately forgets because by the next episode Hans Moleman is back, small and nearly blind and in possession of approximately the worst luck in the history of personhood, ready to be killed again. The show does not explain this. The show presents it as background humor, as a running gag, as the kind of joke that works better the less attention you pay it. And that is probably the correct approach from a comedic standpoint. The moment you start asking questions about Hans Moleman's resurrections is the moment the joke begins to dissolve. But the questions exist. Moleman claimed his age in one episode as 31 years old. He appears to be decades older than that, physically. Something has aged him at an accelerated rate. Something has also made him nearly indestructible, capable of surviving deaths that his frailty should make even more fatal than they would be for a healthier person. These two facts are in direct contradiction in any universe where biology operates normally. In Springfield, they are simply the condition of Hans Moleman's existence. The radiation theory provides the most internally consistent explanation. Whatever the power plant has done to Moleman's cellular biology, it has produced an organism that ages rapidly under normal conditions, but reconstitutes after fatal trauma. He is not surviving his deaths. He is actually dying, biologically ceasing, and then regenerating in ways that his irradiated cells have developed the capacity to do. He is the extreme case, the character who represents what happens when the contamination pushes past mutation into something stranger. He is 31 years old. He has been 31 years old for longer than we have been watching him. He dies and comes back. He dies and comes back. He falls and is hurt and dies and comes back. If the loop is Homer's coma dream, then Moleman is what happens when the dream doesn't have enough resources to keep a minor character fully rendered between appearances. He lapses. He dies. And when the next scene requires him, the dream reconstructs him from the template. Either way, Hans Moleman is the character who most bluntly expresses the fundamental unreality of Springfield. He makes the rules of the place visible by violating them. In a world with normal biology, you die once. In Springfield, some people die dozens of times and return without explanation. And the town, consistent with its fundamental operational principle of accepting whatever is in front of it without inquiry, simply stops at the grocery store next week and says good morning to the man they watched get run over by a bus. Barney Gumble was smart. This tends to get lost in the characterization the show settled into for most of its run, which is Barney as Homer's bar companion, Barney as the background drunk, Barney as the ambient presence at Moe's who exists primarily to burp loudly and make observations that are funnier for being unexpected from someone in his condition. But the show established, in one of its most poignant episodes, that Barney Gumble was a high school classmate of Homer's who was bound for a different life entirely. He had a future. He had the academic credentials and the apparent ambition to go somewhere that was not Springfield, to become someone that the town's limitations would not have been applied to. And then Homer gave him a beer. One beer at a party offered to a teenager who had never had one, and the rest of the story wrote itself because Barney was, it turned out, constitutionally unable to have just one. The alcoholism is not a joke. The show knows it is not a joke. The show has Barney get sober once in an episode that treats his recovery with genuine seriousness, that shows what Barney is like without the fog of constant inebriation. He is articulate. He is creative. He makes a short film that is, within the show's universe, genuinely acclaimed. He is, in sobriety, the person his high school academic record suggested he would become. And then the episode ends, and he has a drink, and the recovery ends, and Barney goes back to the bar. Because Springfield doesn't support sobriety. Not structurally, not in the sense that the town's social infrastructure, the bar as the central gathering place, the pressure toward normalization that every recovered alcoholic knows as the most persistent challenge of recovery, makes staying sober in Springfield an active, daily battle against the environment itself. Barney lost a future to a single bottle of beer and the specific biological predisposition that the beer activated, and has been losing a little more of it every day since at Moe's Tavern. And Homer, who handed him the beer, who made the offer that started the chain, goes home every evening to the house on Evergreen Terrace, without carrying any particular weight about it because Homer does not connect causes to consequences across the kind of time span Barney's story requires. This is not Homer being a bad person. Homer is not equipped for that kind of reckoning. Homer is exactly the kind of person he was made to be, and the kind of person he was made to be is not one who thinks very much about the delayed effects of small choices made at parties decades ago. Barney drinks, Homer drinks beside him. The bar stool is always warm, the story doesn't change. Krusty the Clown is the character who most directly maps onto what happens when you spend your life trying to be loved by a crowd while failing to be loved by your father, Herschel Schmoikel Kristofsky, the son of a rabbi. A child who wanted to be a clown, who loved comedy the way that some children love a thing so completely and so purely that the love becomes its own kind of fate. His father disapproved. His father, a serious man of religious conviction and community standing, looked at his son's desire and saw frivolity, saw waste, saw the rejection of a tradition that he had spent his life maintaining. He told Krusty the Clown was not a dignified profession. He effectively told Krusty that being what he was would cost him his family. Krusty chose comedy. Krusty lost his father. And then he built a career entirely structured around receiving from strangers the love he lost when his father withdrew it. The children who watch Krusty's show, who laugh at the slapstick and wait breathlessly for the big shoes and the balloon animals, and the particular transgressive energy of a clown who drinks too much and has visible contempt for the children he is entertaining, those children are the substitute. They are the applause that fills the space where a father's approval used to be. The problem is that the audience is not apparent. The applause is not love. It is loud and it is regular, and it is, in quantitative terms, more than anyone receives from a single person. But it is not the thing it's substituting for. And Krusty, who has been a professional entertainer for his entire adult life, who has received more applause than almost any other performer alive, is running on empty in the specific way that people run on empty when they are filling themselves with the wrong thing. He smokes. He drinks. He has terrible business instincts and terrible personal instincts, and a lifestyle that is the lifestyle of a man who has decided that if he's going to feel this hollow, he might as well feel it expensively. He gives away more merchandise than he sells. He trusts people who systematically betray him. He is the most recognizable clown in Springfield, and he is, when you look at him in the right light, also the loneliest person in Springfield. More lonely than Lisa, who at least knows what she's looking for. More lonely than Homer, who has Marge and the children, and the specific warmth of a home even when he doesn't notice it. Krusty has an audience, and an audience is the most crowded kind of alone. There is one episode where he reconciles with his father, where the rabbi, played with dignity and sadness by Jackie Mason, finally watches his son perform and laughs, genuinely laughs, and the laugh is the thing. Not the reconciliation speech, not the formal resolution. The laugh. Because the laugh is the father seeing his son, actually seeing him for the first time in decades, and finding in what he sees something worth responding to. The episode is warm, and it resolves beautifully, and then it ends, and the show resets, and Krusty is back at the studio, and the rabbi is back in his synagogue, and the laugh, that one genuine laugh, floats somewhere between them in the Springfield air. The memory of having been seen is not the same as being seen, but it is not nothing. In Springfield, it might be the closest most people get. The floating world. What all of this means. We have spent a long time in Springfield tonight. We have followed Homer through the architecture of his damage and traced it back through the conspiracy of his parents and the ambitions of his employer. We have sat beside Marge in the kitchen and watched the blue hair and heard the hum and understood finally what the hum is carrying. We have skateboarded alongside Bart through the town that decided too early what he was, and walked beside Lisa through the loneliness of being the most awake person in a room that chose sleep. We have watched Maggie watching all of us. We have looked at Burns from the inside and found there a system so complete, so self-sustaining, so perfectly calibrated to its own continuation, that the monster at the center of it is almost incidental, almost beside the point. The system runs. The system sustains itself. The monster is just the part of the system that signs the checks. We have looked at Ned and found the rage underneath the smile, and the tragedy underneath the rage, and the particular cruelty of a universe that gives the devout man silence and the distracted man conversation. We have watched Willie maintain something perfect in a place that does not value perfection. We have watched Skinner be someone else's life so long that it became his. We have watched Bob be brilliant in a context that cannot reward it. We have watched Barney dissolve and Krusty perform and Molman die and come back and die again. What is the theory that holds all of this together? The theory that holds all of it together is not the radiation, though the radiation is real. It is not the coma, though the coma is internally consistent and emotionally devastating. It is not the collective denial, though Springfield's capacity for motivated forgetting is one of its most consistently demonstrated characteristics. The theory that holds all of this together is simpler and stranger and more intimate than any of those. It is that Springfield is a portrait of what America does to the people inside it. Not a satire, or not only a satire, a portrait. The kind of portrait that a very good painter makes when they want to show you not just the face, but the forces that shaped it. The radiation is not just radiation. It is every invisible system that damages people without their knowledge or consent, that accumulates in the body and the mind over years of exposure, that produces symptoms that look like character traits, that makes people compliant not through visible coercion, but through the slow, quiet erosion of the capacity to resist. Homer's IQ of 55 is not just a cartoon punchline. It is what happens when the systems that are supposed to protect people, the medical establishment, the educational institution, the regulatory apparatus, are all owned by the same person who benefits from their failure. It is the specific cognitive outcome of being raised in an environment where your potential is a liability to the people who profit from your limitations. Marge's compressed interiority is not just a domestic comedy trope. It is what happens when the person who holds everything together is never asked what she needs, not because the people around her are cruel, but because the architecture of their dependence on her makes the question feel threatening to the structure that everyone is already inside. Bart's rebellion is not just a child being difficult. It is the only available response to an environment that has made every legitimate avenue for the expression of his particular kind of intelligence into a disciplinary category. Lisa's isolation is not just a smart kid thing. It is the systematic product of a system that generates intelligence and then fails to provide any container for it, that produces people capable of seeing the problems clearly and then ensures they exist in contexts where seeing clearly has no leverage. And Maggie's silence is not developmental. It is strategic. It is the most intelligent read of the situation available, which is that visibility is a cost and invisibility is a resource. And in Springfield, you accumulate the resources you need, or you spend yourself in the performance of being seen. The floating timeline, the eternal present of Springfield, the fact that nobody ages and nobody changes and the loop keeps running, is the show's thesis. It is the argument the show has been making, episode by episode, for 36 years, about what America wants from its stories about itself. It wants this. It wants the house that doesn't change. It wants the parents who are always together and the children who are always young, and the neighborhood that is always recognizable from the road. It wants the couch and the television and Homer stumbling through the door at 5:30 and the music starting and everything being fine. America pressed pause in 1989 and called it The Simpsons and has been watching the paused image ever since. Not because it doesn't understand that time is passing, that the children in the real world are growing up and moving away, and that the house on the real evergreen terrace is different now, older, emptier, not the same as it was in the memory. But because as long as the television is on, as long as Bart is 10 and Lisa is 8 and Homer is alive and Marge is patient and the beer is cold and the pacifier is in Maggie's mouth and everything is exactly as it was, we don't have to acknowledge how much time has gone. We can go home. That is what Springfield is. It is the home we keep on television because we cannot keep it anywhere else. The family we cannot let go of because letting them go means admitting that the particular version of ordinary life they represent, chaotic and dysfunctional and warm, is not something we live in anymore, that we grew up. That the world changed. That the couch we sat on as children watching the opening credits is somewhere else now, or gone entirely. The dark theory behind every Simpsons character is not about radiation or comas or corporate conspiracy, though all of those things are there, threaded through the show like veins in a leaf. The dark theory is that every character in Springfield is exactly what they were made to be by the forces that shaped them. And the forces that shaped them are the forces that shape all of us. Loss and compromise and the particular surrender of small ambitions under the pressure of immediate need. The way parents make choices for children that the children inherit as personalities. The way systems damage people in ways that look like character, that feel like selfhood, that are impossible to fully separate from the person who was there before the damage. And the loop runs, and nobody ages, and Homer falls down and gets up, and Marge hums in the kitchen, and Bart writes on the chalkboard, and Lisa plays the saxophone in a room that is never quite quiet enough to hear it properly. And Maggie watches. We pressed pause in 1989. We have been watching the same image for 36 years. And the image watches us back, patient as Marge, silent as Maggie, durable as Homer, smart enough to know what it's doing. Springfield will be here when you wake up. It always is. That's the whole point.